right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Let's see. Yes, it's recording. Good. So if there is anyone here to use privilege of the floor to address the planning board, please raise your hand and you will be recognized in the order that you do so. All right. Seeing none, I think we'll go ahead and get started with our meeting. So, great. So, oh, bless you. I hope everyone's all right. Hang in there in this cold and a little bit more snowy weather. So just a little brief bit. So I mean, by this time, I think everyone has seen the revised draft law. And in working on that, I sort of tried to err on the side of doing more rather than less, feeling that in committee, it's easier to delete a paragraph than to try to figure out what paragraph to write. So, you know, no worries if you say, oh, this is too much. I sort of expected to go that way, if anything. So on the hand, there may be things you want to include that aren't in there yet. So anyway, that was the sort of, you know, the intent in what I did. You know, it's quite a bit different than what we started. We're looking at a month ago, a couple of weeks ago. Some of the bones of that Lansing law are still showing through, sometimes in uncomfortable ways. And so that's some of the stuff we need to sort of smooth out. So it's kind of like a paper that you've rewritten that you couldn't quite get rid of the old structure. It's still somewhat there. And so sometimes I was kind of forced into an awkward corner because I didn't think to really rethink things completely. And so I think we can make some improvements there. So to start, what I was thinking of doing is sort of going down that list that I sent out of sort of, as I labeled them, higher order questions in a very self-congratulatory way, but that we deal with some of those things that sort of dealt with overall structure and thoughts of the law, and then delve into more detailed section by section comments, such as the stuff, you know, Jonathan got on grazing, or we've had on fencing, and, you know, review various definitions and things like that. Does that sound like a reasonable plan forward?
Yes.
All right. So first question I had down had to do with, so the first, you know, the Lansing law basically had solar facilities and small stuff. And so I decided, okay, as I started and thought about it, I realized that I wanted to do something different than what they did to define sort of small versus large. And that's where I picked a 5-acre number. And that number in particular, we can definitely debate. But as I wrote things and came and looked at the unified solar permit, I realized, you know, there's actually something else going on here too, which is that small, you know, I always wanted to be able to exempt small systems someone's going to put on the rooftop. There's no reason to go through site plan review if you're going to put, you know, a 10 kilowatt solar array on top of your house, right? So that gave me the thought that, okay, anything that could use a unified solar permit, which is 25 kilowatts or less, could do so. And that would be the total review. But I'd already started with a small versus large division at 5 acres, and suddenly I was stuck, and I wasn't clever enough to get myself out of my hole. So I have since thought that maybe we should just say, okay, a small scale solar facility is 25 kilowatts or less. A medium-sized one is, again, we'll pick the number 5, you know, acres or less, and a large one is something bigger than that. And the reason for the size acreage rather than a kilowatt or megawatt number is mostly in terms of land use. Area disturbed is kind of, you know, the key thing. So that was my thinking. And so the question I have in general committee is, okay, does that seem reasonable? Or rather than having small systems and then dividing small systems in the law into 25 or not, just go ahead and call them small, medium, and large. That's the first question.
Yes, this is Barb. I like the small, medium, and large, and I would encourage that we rewrite the law to pertain to that. I think it's cleaner and more understandable.
Okay. Anybody else want to say something, or in particular, if someone wants to disagree? Okay, I got a hands up there, thumbs up from Will, looks like. So, okay, so that's a simple, you know, redrafting. I can take care of that. I did want to point out that in the definitions, one of the changes I made, and let me see if I can, it's not worth sharing the screen on that right now. So we talked briefly last time about the fact that you can do solar electricity by heating a fluid. So you have mirrors and stuff that focus on something and you heat the fluid hot and that can make electricity. That definition actually wasn't in the law. Their solar thermal definition had to do with making hot fluids, as in domestic hot water or the solar pool heater. And their law covered that. So there are now 3 definitions in the law. One is for solar photovoltaic systems, makes sense, the sort of solar panels we all think of. Solar thermal heating, which as we discussed last time is like not going to happen, but it is used out in the West where there's lots of sunshine. And solar thermal power, which is not used out in the West and not going to happen here, probably because of the intensity of the sunlight required. And solar thermal heating, which is heating a fluid for some other use besides generating electricity. To be honest, again, that's one of those bones poking through from the Lansing law. I do not know if we should be talking about solar thermal heating, that is domestic hot water or pool heaters at all in this law. So I tossed it out there. What do people think? And Jonathan, do you want to say anything? I'm not sure.
I just wanted to make the comment back when you were talking about the size, the 5 acres, that is about twice what I have seen in most of the other laws. They talk about 100,000 square feet. And I think an acre is 40-something thousand square feet. So is that? I
want us to address that question, but I don't want to address that question now because I don't want to because I think it can be an involved discussion, an important discussion on the sides. I just wanted to do small, medium, large. What the definition of medium is, I think we should work on. Agreed. So right now, in terms of solar thermal heating, like again, a hot water panel on the roof, is there a reason for this law to apply to it? Or are there large systems like this that is a valid reason for the town to get involved in regulating or approving? I'm not all that aware of these systems. So it looks like.
Are there swimming pools? I mean,
pardon?
I would say that for just a home, like I've got some thermal for my hot showers and stuff, but that should be like the under 25 kilowatts. But I could imagine, a community swimming pool that decided that they wanted to use thermal heating, putting in something much larger. I don't know if that's an issue, a likely thing to happen around here or not.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mark. You want to say anything, or?
Yeah, I'm thinking. I suspect that large scale solar thermal is probably not likely here. So I don't know. If you put it on your home, you would have to get a building permit, and so that it's structurally appropriate. But I don't know.
Okay. Anybody else?
Currently, this might be a different, broader question, but did someone else have their hand up first? I don't want to.
Well, so I see Will, I think, has a hand up. Is that, I think, right? The 277 is you, Will? Let's see. I'm gonna unmute her. I think she should be able to. I don't know what happens when I ask a phone to unmute.
Okay.
Can she do a *6?
I gave that instruction, so I think she knows how to do that.
Okay.
Well, yes.
So, okay. I think it's already covered under residential requirements, right? Because people have been putting systems up, and I think they already get inspected and all that. And it's not generally recommended that you have ground-mounted solar thermal. So I agree with, I think Mark was saying, you're not, or maybe Jonathan, you're not apt to have large systems. So as long as it's covered under regular permitting, yeah, I don't see a reason to even mention it.
Okay, thanks, Will. Anybody else?
Yeah, I tend to agree there. I don't see any reason to do it. They're typically, I can't imagine them ever reaching a scale where they would have an impact. Especially
Yeah.
that kind.
I'm reading this. Okay. All
I
right.
just something in the chat. It's hard. I don't want to interrupt anybody, but that's my thought. I don't know if you can see the chat, but
I just looked at it. Yeah, I can't dual task very well. So you guys all very obviously saw me reading this note, which suggests.
we've been chatting and being on Zoom probably since 8 a.m. most of us.
Yeah, sorry. I say I'm Zoom novice here.
It's okay. The thought is, because I don't, forgive me if this is in there that I don't remember, but if there's not already some sort of clause to allow for emerging, new, developing, whatever, infrastructure that like could conceivably fall under the law, like can we just include that in the law to allow for, change?
I'll take comment from Mark or Tim. I think the way stuff normally happens, if it's in the law, it's covered, but also if it's not, it's weird because of course Carolina doesn't have any zoning, but usually if something disturbs enough area, it would get caught by site plan review. It just wouldn't fall under this law. So, and that is a 1 acre threshold right now. So most significant things will get caught by site plan, and it'll just be a different, they won't have all the specifications in the law, but there will be some sort of review. Go ahead, Tim.
No, I was just going to say that I think Catherine is pointing something that it might be appropriate just to have some gesture in the law to making future provisions for new technologies or something like that, so that the site review board would have some guidance or something in the law. And I don't know how this would work to encourage revision of the law upon consideration of new technological development, something like that.
And Jonathan, your hand is either still up or you want to speak again.
I sort of agree with that. I just wanted to add in, one of the things that I don't see in our law, unless I've missed it, that I saw a few times in the other laws was a clause that says pre-existing solar installations do not have to upgrade themselves automatically to meet this law. I would assume that if they ever wanted to upgrade, they did want to upgrade or, somehow their system, they would then fall under it, but we don't want to hit them sort of after the fact with regulations that they didn't know about.
Okay, good point. Again, Tim and Mark, my understanding is that that's sort of de facto true, that existing systems are grandfathered in. Any law I think is that way. But Tim and Mark, do you think we need an explicit clause saying that? Or anyone else who has expertise in this matter?
Yeah, the only thing I'm thinking of is I think the site plan law has a provision if existing facilities are increased by X percent, I think it's 10%, then they are subject to the law. So we might want to consider something like that.
Yeah, I think then, so Will brought that up in the past, you can fix to the point where, because since the capacity of panels keeps going up year by decade, suddenly something can get fixed and suddenly be a different creature than it was because it's twice the power because they just replaced the panels by, because they needed it. I'm good with that. We have some, again, we can explicitly either just say, existing systems are fine as is, but if they upgrade, they need to come up to code, essentially come up to this law. In terms of the provision for new technologies, Catherine or Tim, would you be willing to write that little fragment for the law? I'm seeing a nod from Catherine.
Sure. Yeah. Is there,
Great, thank you.
I'll look into it. I'm sure there's
Yeah.
some official way to do that.
That's why I'm asking you to do it. Probably is.
And if there's not, our attorney will make sure to clarify you.
Exactly.
Yes, that's right.
You get so moved. Okay.
Yes, right, yeah. Speaking of which, so I think that if we get far enough tonight, it's probably time to have Guy take a look at this, but it might, we'll need to do one, I think, iteration of changes based on what we say tonight, and then get it to him, because if he says, oh my God, all of this is crazy, well, we may need to change things a little bit, so.
Well, I would, back at that solar thermal heating thing, I noticed that
Yes.
though we included in our definition section,
Right.
a kind of extensive definition of it. And if we're not saying anything, should that be altered or removed, or?
My suggestion would be to take that out, and then the law no longer applies to solar thermal heating, I think. And there would be it would not be included in the definition of a solar facility. That'd be my recommendation.
Right. And I think that in terms of the new technologies, the issue is always going to be more that idea of replacement, which gets back to the idea of remediation and things like that, more than things like area, because the likelihood is that things are going to become more efficient rather than less efficient, so that area coverage and everything should theoretically be reduced to accomplish the same goals. But what happens with the old panels and things like that, that gets back to there.
Okay. Yeah. I think it's more like they'll keep the same area and just upgrade their power, because once you disturb it, you disturb it. So next big question I had to do with the whole concept of a non-grid tied facility. And whether, my original thinking was that we could exempt small things that weren't grid tied because, sort of what harm can they do? But the real question is do we have a role as a town in regulating non-grid tied systems at all up until the point where they become grid tied, as Will had pointed out in a note recently? So that's the general question. Do we apply this law to anything that is not tied to the grid? And if we do so, do we still say, how do you make sure that someone's solar, electric fence, charger, which is strictly a solar panel and a battery, is not covered, because it's kind of silly to have that as part of the law. So,
Bill, is it fair to say that the issue is less whether it's tied to the grid and more what scale is happening? I don't know this technology well enough, but could there conceivably be a huge solar field of the scale big enough, say, to run a farm that's not tied to the grid? I don't know. You hear
Right.
what I'm just thinking out loud?
yeah. No, and it looks like Will's gonna have a comment on that. And I think that I don't know the energy needs of a farm. 25 kilowatts, which is the unified solar permit level, is pretty big. I've got a pretty big set on my house that's only 12.5 kilowatts. But a farm, I suppose, could easily use 2 or 3 times that size. Would a farm want to be off grid? Yeah, I don't know. It still wouldn't cover a huge amount of area, but let's see what Will has to add to that. Will?
Am I on mute?
Yes,
No.
you are unmuted. You're fine, Will.
Oh, okay. Well, what I was thinking about is people wanting to make microgrids, and really the switch could call in a different authority, but mainly I think you just want to make sure it meets any electrical requirements, because I think that, electrical requirements plus it looks like we are including information about underground power lines and things like that. So you just want to make sure that the switch will cause that type of review to be initialized. either way, if someone were to go from grid tied to not being grid tied and they're fairly large, like even 3 or 4 megawatts, I think you want an electrical inspection. So the question is, what would trigger that?
I mean, good point. I guess the question I was first trying to ask is, are we going to exempt non-grid tied systems pretty much entirely? You have raised a different question, which is, well, let's say they decide to hook up later on, and do we need to watch for that? Or like you say, whether they decide to go offline in the future. But I first just want to figure out whether we have a role in regulating non-grid tied systems. And Tim asked the question about size, and I don't have a great answer. We got Jonathan up next, and then maybe if Will wants to say some more.
Yeah, I just wanted to say it's hard for me to imagine a larger commercial enterprise that would not want to be grid tied. If they need a lot of electricity to run their milking machines and chill them and all that stuff, they have to have that every day of the year, regardless of weather and everything else. So I don't think that those kinds of farm systems would ever be viable if they weren't grid tied.
Yeah, I see Catherine.
What about a data center?
A data center?
Yeah, or what about any kind of setup that's originally set up as a backup system for what you have, and then later, for whatever reason, they decide to go for the money of the market?
So I really want to sever the question of what if something is non-grid tied and decides to become grid tied from the question of, do non-grid tied systems get covered by this law? I agree that if they become grid tied, there's every reason for at that point there to be electrical inspections, and I assume that the utility is going to anyway. But I'm still I'm still of torn mind as to whether we have a role as a town in trying to regulate. If someone wants to build their house off grid and put in, 20 kilowatts of solar, they could get the unified solar permit then, but do we even ask them to do that? Or if they do 30 kilowatts for some reason, do we have a reason to ask them to come to us and get a site plan review? Barbara.
So I guess the question for me is, I would lean towards this law does not pertain to non-grid facilities. But my question is, are there other mechanisms that would provide some level of review or oversight to a structure like that? And I would assume that that building guidelines or construction permitting, whatever that's called, that somehow there is a town level review from a building permit. Is that true?
Yeah, I'm wondering the same thing, Barb. And I think grid tied systems should have electrical inspections, and so I'm going to have to check on how that's handled. I don't recall it coming up. I don't remember the code officers ever dealing with off-grid systems, and I actually know that I put in a 492 watt solar system completely on my own. And but I actually believe that something like that does merit at least an electrical inspection. But I don't know.
So here's my take out, and then we'll go to, looks like Jonathan and Will want to speak again, is one reason for making sure that it's, you did it yourself, right? You were happy and you could live with that. Anyone who lives off grid can say, okay, I'll live with the consequences if my system blows up on me. But then they go and they sell the house, right, to somebody else. So that's a potential reason for the town to have a role in making sure these standards these systems meet some sort of minimum standards.
Right.
And Robert, to your point, clearly if they put it on the house, right, then there's gonna be a building permit, building inspection. But if you're sticking in your yard while you're building your house, does that other facility in the yard ever have requirements on it? And I think that's the question. Okay, I think we'll go, it looks like Jonathan and Will are still got hands raised. Jonathan.
Yeah, I just had a minor point. I can see where we might not want to include off-grid systems. I would say, I was advocating earlier for a paragraph about pre-existing systems aren't covered by this law, but I think the act of becoming grid tied should make it completely subject to the law, and they should have to, if they have to upgrade, they have to upgrade, but it should have to meet the requirements. Because otherwise it's a loophole, you know, they can build
Yes.
whatever they want.
Right, that's a good point.
And then
No, I agree, absolutely. We're on this narrow topic of non-grid tied systems, but absolutely, if they connect with the grid, I think that's a good time for the town to intervene and make sure they meet all applicable. I mean, I assume the utility is going to check on that anyway, right? You know, they don't want to connect somebody else that's going to bring their grid down. But all right, so Will and then Tim.
So for new systems going in, they're more likely to have batteries involved, and you know, those are becoming more readily available. So in my mind, I guess the question would be, if you have the battery as part of your off-grid system, how is it covered in the battery section?
Yeah, we haven't done much with the battery section yet, so I can't. I think that my view of the battery section is going to be that it has a division of small and large for sure, because there's utility scale battery systems. And on the small side, at some level, which might be really tiny, you should inform the fire people, as you pointed out, Will, that you have batteries. But beyond that, I haven't thought much more about that battery section. And, you know, whether or not you have the batteries as part of a solar array. Tim, you had something you wanted to say.
Yeah, I was just going to say quickly that I think what I'd recommend doing is just assuming that the non-tied systems won't be covered by the law, but before settling on that, checking with Corey to make sure that there's a public safety net underneath that. If there isn't, we're going to want one in, whether people want it or not. It's a matter of public safety, just like building permits.
Okay, so you're saying that even if it stays non-grid tied, that there's some minimum level of inspection, in particular, so that someone wants to sell their house.
Or not even sell their house. We want to make sure that the people who put it in are safe as well. I mean, that's why we have building codes.
Okay.
But it's probably, my hunch is this might be covered under the code law, so we can find out.
Okay, I think that's good, because I think it's probably time to move on. Will, you have a little bit you want to finish up with on this? Because your hand is still up.
My hand?
Yes.
Your blue hand.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, because every time I hit start something, the voice comes on, and then I can no longer hear what you guys are saying. So I'm trying to not keep switching on and off. You
Okay.
can't turn my hand off? That would be
Oh,
nice if you could just turn it
Yes,
off when I speak.
I can turn off the hand, so I turned it off for
Okay.
you, Will.
Oh, great, thank you, because I don't know how to do that. Okay, Val, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say that it goes back to Tim's earlier comment that I think that size is still is the matter, and I don't know whether there would ever be such a very large sort of non-grid array, but I think that size should still be the thing that kicks it off. I mean, in a lot of the codes that I've seen, that actually you can't even put it in the yard unless it's very specific, because, for example, there are codes that say that you can never put it in a front yard, which I think is a kind of irrelevant in our case. But the thing is that there are these issues that somehow it gets back to the visual impact statement, which we do include there. And it's possible that one could have a private off-grid array that has a sort of very negative visual impact, from the public realm.
Jonathan, then I'm going to respond to Val too. Jonathan, go ahead.
What was I going to say? Why don't you go first, Bill?
Okay, no problem. So Val agreed, though, again, 25 kilowatts goes under the unified solar permit, and there's no visual review other than to say it should slope at the same angle as the roof if it's on a building. If it's in a yard, the unified solar permit doesn't talk at all about that. Now, 25 kilowatts is not a huge array. I just think it's fairly unlikely there's going to be a 30 or 40 kilowatt array that's not grid tied. It just, it doesn't mean it can't happen, but it just seems unlikely. So it might be that we're worrying too much about something that's, a small chance. But point taken, and let's keep thinking about it. Jonathan.
Yeah, my thought actually was relevant to that, because for the production of electricity, it's hard to imagine a large system being economically viable if it's not grid tied. But the laws, as written in the definition, seems to also include things like solar energy splitting of water to make hydrogen gas. That doesn't have to be grid tied. You could have a huge installation that was collecting a lot of sunlight and using it for some of these chemical processes, and the only thing you're exporting are the chemical processes, the products. So you wouldn't want to exempt them, I don't think.
Good point. So that gets back to indeed having some sort of size delimiter that, okay, we won't worry about non-grid tied systems below some size, which is going to either be a wattage or acreage number, but maybe above that we do. And to Val's point, if they take up enough area, there's certainly a lot of good reason for the town to want to review them above some area. And we in rough agreement on that? Okay. Okay. Non-electric. So yes, we will have something in there for large systems, and I'll work on what that means. All right, so then the other idea I had thrown out during the week was the idea of, to the extent that it might be relevant, creating a set of preferred habitats where usually putting a large system in, you get a little bit of a preferential treatment in the law in terms of the regulatory oversight. That is the extent to which the medium scale systems have less requirements on them than the large scale systems. And I got some positive notes so far on that, but I do want to have that discussion. And I did follow a bit with both Dave Bonter and John Confer in terms of what I spelled out, and I can share that as well. But first, if no one wants to do this, then it'd be silly for me to spend much time on it. So thoughts on just that whole idea of that. Barb.
I think the idea has merit to consider, but can you give, and I'm sorry, I don't recall this from the early communications, could you give a few examples of what the incentives would be, like what requirements would be reduced for them?
So it would be, yeah, so it's the differences in a medium scale versus large scale system. So the large scale system has extra requirements in terms of they have to follow like the ag guidelines to restore ag land. They have to do a species inventory and look for endangered species and stuff on grasslands and shrublands, that kind of stuff. They have to basically just provide more documentation. So there's more requirements placed on those large systems because they potentially have more environmental and visual impacts. So like the smaller medium systems, and this is a key question, didn't necessarily have a requirement of vegetative screening, whereas the large scale systems did. And again, small was like 4 or 5 acres, so that seemed okay.
Right. Yeah.
So-
And so just to jump in here, that, I understand that there are differences, between small, medium and large. I guess what I'm trying to suggest is, in order to say that I'm in favor of this, I would really need to know what are the things that are being relaxed. Because
Yeah.
some of the things on the list that you went through, I personally would not want to relax them, even
Right,
if they did
that's
put
right.
it in a good habitat. So to me, this is a more specific issue. Like one thing, I think the current one took out the decommissioning plan for small and I think medium systems, which I don't agree with. And so we'll get to
Mhm.
that when we get to that. But that's an example of
Right.
what I would not want to, to take out. So to me, it needs a little bit more specificity to be able to say yay or nay for me.
Okay. Good point. Anybody else?
I agree with Barb.
Yeah, I had the same thought about the decommissioning.
Okay. So that's fine. And if we can come up with an acceptable set of reduced requirements, but not exactly those medium scale ones, would that be the sort of way to maybe go with this then? To try to make it enticing, but not relax some of the things that we think might be important. Go ahead, Catherine.
Well, I guess I have a question, which is how much is this just us deciding, and how much is like, I guess I worry a little, we don't actually have as much power as we are implying we do in creating this law. Like all the discussions that have gone back and forth have been really fascinating and interesting, and like, that's great. But as I've read them, to be honest, I've been like, well, it doesn't matter substantively in terms of what goes in this law, because the law, we don't have control over these things, really. Just because we decide we're going to make an arbitrary designation of what small, medium, large is, like, do we have that power? I don't think we do.
We have the power to say what size systems get what, we have to meet what requirements. Yes. We don't have the power to say you can't build in a grassland, for example, right? Because there's no way to differentiate spots in the town without zoning. This is the one thing that we sort of do have some authority over, which is we can say, yeah, if you're 25 kilowatts or less, all you got to do is do a unified solar permit. That's fine for the town of Caroline. We have that authority. What we don't have authority to is say, you've got to jump through these 10,000 hoops that the state doesn't require for a 100 megawatt plant, because we'll probably lose in court. So what we do have is the ability, I think, to sort of set different levels of thresholds below the state level in our town, and maybe encourage development in a certain area because of that. But we don't have a lot of control. That's how I see it. Michelle had her hand.
Barb, well, can I just go back to Barb and ask, is that kind of what you're want specificity on, is like the things that are more specific than the state requires is what you want more information on, or you're talking about?
I just want to know specifically what would we relax for somebody who places their facility in a desirable location for us. So which of the requirements
Yeah.
for large sites would be relaxed?
Okay. And excellent. I just, ran out of steam. I think it's a great point and a great question. And so I think that we can work on that. Michelle had a question or a statement or something.
Well, I don't have this memorized or anything, but doesn't the seeker law kind of do the same thing? Like aren't the class 2 or if they're built, say, on a brownfield or something, they don't have to fill out, say, the long form.
Right.
I guess, so they're kind of doing that already. So I guess that's kind of what I thought maybe you had in mind.
That was sort of one of the things that gave me the idea. That plus
Yeah.
I just originally started with, geez, it would be great if we could encourage them to go on top of crappy land. In practice, there's not, okay, so the list I had was things like, brownfield site is a perfect example. We don't have one in Caroline, but I put it in the law, but that would be great, but we don't have one. Other non-contaminated industrial sites, we don't really have either. Eventually the gravel pit would be that kind of place, right? When they finally are done. I also put in, tops of commercial buildings and parking lots. If we were to have a mall, that would be relevant. Caroline doesn't have them all, right? So all of those things are like totally irrelevant for Caroline, but I threw them in because I thought they were nice. What we do have is, from a wildlife perspective, more and less desirable habitat in terms of scarcity, both of the habitat and species. And so the most valuable thing we have in terms of it's sort of disappearing, and it affects some species of concern, is grassland and shrubland habitat. And one would never want to cut down an old growth forest or frankly a really mature hardwood forest. And so the other two categories I threw in the law were basically young, or as I talked to John, sapling forest, and maybe a really late stage successional field that was just about to become sapling forest. Those are two habitats that we have in spades in Caroline, that while they have species that prefer them, they aren't species that are necessarily endangered or threatened or whatever. So it seemed that that would be a good thing to encourage people to build on, rather than going over that nice grassy hayfield that maybe is valuable for other things. So that was my thinking in terms of how I set things up. But I think Barb was entirely on point that, I was somewhat sloppy in specifying what the rules would be because I didn't want to create a fourth set of regulations. And so I think we could sharpen that up. And I'm not sure why I started saying all that. It was in response to some comment, and I'm sorry now, I forgot where I was going. Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna mention one thing that comes from my paranoiac, skeptical side. I mean, I'm wondering if one goes this route, whether it wouldn't be prudent to have something in there about contiguity, because I could imagine a really smart commercial developer not wanting to do what we're asking them to do on a large scale, and then just starting to build stuff piecemeal. And eventually they get what they want, but they don't have to do what we're asking. You hear what I'm just saying?
Yeah, I think it's
And clearly that's paranoid, but I'm paranoid when it comes to big corporations.
I think it's sort of like a severability sort of thing, or a segmentation, which they call it in like utility proceedings. You can't segment your project into smaller projects and have each one reviewed as a small project when really it's one big project. So it's a non-segmentation thing. Val?
Yeah, because actually I've experienced that, because for years when I was on the City of Ithaca Design Review Board and things, that is the standard operating procedure of many of the developers there in Ithaca, is to accumulate things and get incremental allowances, and then to eventually get to this, well, if I don't get this, then you won't get this, and it begins to be a kind of a horrible trap, right? And I'm not necessarily paranoid. I just see it as reality.
Okay, so I have a note to add as some sort of non-segmentation clause that a project has to really be, the whole project. I will go through my preferred habitats thing and sharpen up and come up with a list of, okay, here's what would be reduced for it. And then we'll see if we like it or not. And I'm okay with throwing it out. It was just the one little thing I thought we might be able to do, and maybe it's not worth it. Jonathan?
Yeah, if somebody's, if we're talking about solar arrays, incrementally adding to them, wouldn't the act of that increment that put it over the edge suddenly makes it subject to a whole bunch of rules that maybe it wasn't subject to before? And unless they're gonna, I don't know how that you can define the whole system, but if they've got one substation, for instance, one interconnection, everything going through that interconnection would be one system. So that would trigger things already from what we've talked about if they did that. But I agree, developers love to do that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And honestly, I don't know how to word the thing. Maybe your idea through one particular substation is a good one. I have no idea how to actually write that, and it's going to take some work. It might not be, someone smarter than me might probably have to do it. So Ken Miller has raised his hand, and Ken, we did privilege the floor earlier, but I'm going to let you you have a couple minutes here because I think you want to add some and your comments are usually helpful. So Ken, why don't you go ahead and address us for a couple minutes and then we'll move on from there.
Am I unmuted?
You are.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Mostly I just have a quick question, really. I've been trying to follow along with your conversations and the written manual here you got. And you're talking about 3 different sizes. That's not in here. So are you talking about has the law changed quite a bit since the one I have has been written? Is that the case? Why I can't seem to follow along?
I can't answer your question because I don't know which version you're looking at, but a new version was put on the planning board website basically a week ago or 4 or 5 days ago, something like that. So if you don't have something within the last 4 or 5 days, then you are probably totally mystified about what we're talking about.
Because mine doesn't have small, medium, and large in it. And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah. The other,
okay, so that's what I had on that I just pulled off the web. So okay, I'm out of
Right.
touch.
Yeah,
No,
so-
no,
All right.
let me,
Thanks a lot.
yeah,
Barbara, go ahead.
hang on a second, just a clarification, Ken. The one that you have on the web is likely the right one. The small, medium, and large language is not in the written law yet, right? The current version, the accurate version that you should be looking at refers to small and large. But what we're talking about is adding a medium section to clarify what's in the version you have, which is like 2 different kinds of small. So I think you're actually on the right one if you pulled it off the web recently.
Okay, thanks for that clarification, Barb. All right. All right, so we have 10 minutes left in our 1-hour meeting. And I was going to quickly look over the unified solar permit, but I don't think we're going to bother. You guys can look at it. As I mentioned, it does have language that says that if you're putting this on top of the roof, then there has to be a strength analysis done as part of the unified solar permit process. So that was one of the questions I had, and it's right in there. Ken, do you want to talk to us quickly for again? Or is that, no, sorry, that's Will. Sorry, Will?
Yeah, quickly, in the NYSERDA model solar law, the distinctions they make are really up to 25 kilowatts and for on-site consumption. They gear it to on-site consumption. And then above that, so I just wanted to put that in there, that is one thing that we can include, what the intention of the system is for review, so that something for off-site consumption is treated differently than on-site.
And Will, that's correct. And that's how the Lansing law had some language to that effect. I got rid of it. We can go back in because frankly, to me, from a land use perspective, the intent of the power wasn't relevant. And so I decided in the end that we would just go with the uniform solar permit for small systems, but anything above, we would do something different with. And I know you probably want to follow up with that, but I want to get through a couple more things in the time we've got. So let's continue the intent of the power at a later time.
Yeah, put my hand down.
Okay, thanks. Someone can do that because I'm not that good at that. So I do want to talk about this division between medium and large. I think that's probably a key thing for us to do. And battery stuff we haven't touched at all, and that will have to be next meeting. I haven't done any work on it, but if anyone who looks at that battery section has stuff they want to think about, I have put this version in the Google Documents as a Google document so that multiple people can edit it at the same time. I need to go through and make sure it really is the final version I came up with. If we're going to do a lot of work on it, that's probably the way to do it. And so if people want, I will do that. We'll get a Google Doc version there that people can tweak and work on. So that's where like Catherine can add her language. And if someone wants to start working on the battery section, that would be great. But I'm going to quickly, I want to clarify one thing. Will, you had a question about systems, since you just, the seeker and the teaker sort of documents. I do want to make sure you're clear that the seeker is only required for something that's above 25 kilowatts. Nothing that has a unified solar permit needs that. And if you're only 30 kilowatts and putting it on your barn, then you can use the short form seeker environmental assessment form and basically answer no to everything, because if it's on a barn, you don't have to worry about impinging on, wetlands and stuff. So I don't find it a problem that we're asking for a seeker that might apply to a 30 kilowatt system. I just think it would be an easy thing to ask. All right.
Okay.
So, yeah, how big is big enough that you're large versus medium? I threw 5 acres out there, yeah, pretty arbitrarily. And indeed, looking at the seeker stuff, it's possible that one might want to pick 2.5 acres. The reason for that is that there's a special threshold if you're an ag district, that if you disturb more than 2.5 acres, you have to use the long form anyway. So that's one possible decision for a dividing point. The other had to do with power level, and just sort of, again, we have honestly, hundreds of acres still of good farmland and other nice land. If someone wants to do something on 3 or 4 or 5 acres, I might care, but the question is, does the town really have a strong role to care and put big requirements on that? Is what acreage is small enough that we can let people do whatever the heck they want? So, or not quite whatever they want, but that is the medium scale, not the large scale. The 5 acres means the system would be somewhere in the 500 kilowatts to megawatt size. So it's not tiny. And so that'd be another rationale for making things smaller at the upper end of the medium size, but I'm not sure. So that's my rough thoughts. And let's have some discussion about threshold for medium versus large. Jonathan.
Yeah, I one of the things that caught my attention when Will was talking a minute ago is if you do have an on-site consumption as part of the definition of a medium size, that doesn't just apply to electric systems. If somebody's making a chemical energy product and they're planning to use it in their own tractor on their own farm, that would be different than if they're selling it for commercial purposes. So possibly that on-site consumption has catches a broader array of issues.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, this is a difficult thing to think about because we don't have zoning, but one of the instances that I could think of where a 2.5 trigger instead of a 5 trigger would have to do with if a 5 acre project was going to be developed in one of our more residentially dense areas and abut upon properties, it might be worth reviewing, just in relationship to social, cultural comfort, if not politesse.
But I agree. So yes, the question is, how big, since we can't specify a part of town to have different rules than another.
No, I mean, that's why that would be the rationale for having a 2.5 as opposed to a 5. That's what I'm saying.
Good. Okay. Anyone else?
I guess my comment is another question about just coming back to what the rationale is for caring about this at all. Like, is it aesthetic? Is it code? Is it safety? Is it because there are a lot of different reasons to care. And I think it's important to really be intentional about why we do care. And so if I'm being totally honest, I'm not really clear right now why we care as we're talking about it.
Okay, so I'm taking your answer to that question to mean that maybe anything that doesn't qualify for a unified solar permit would all have exactly the same regulations and review. You're wondering.
If they decide it's not a health and safety risk, there's not, like what Tim's referring to, which I agree with, right, is like, what is the impact of a large anything, whether that's solar, whether it's a store, whether it's a housing development, right? It's like, we're just talking about what the character and quality is of the town, and what, the comings and goings and access, and like, is it going to impact traffic? Is it going to impact all these things, right? So to me, solar, like, that's one way to look at it. It's just another project that we have to care about where it goes. If there's something specific about solar where there's like some sort of health and safety thing, that's different. And I just want to make sure I'm clear for myself, because I think I'm losing a little bit of focus of why we're just.
I mean, Catherine, I was actually thinking health and safety when I mentioned that example, just in terms of thinking of some of the issues that the task force considered, in terms of whether it would be noise, light, traffic, all kinds of stuff like that. So I was thinking much more of health and safety than I was, say, of aesthetics or something like that.
Okay, and I'll let me go to Val and Will, and then if I feel I need to say something, I will. So Val.
Yeah. I would tend to agree that we should go to the 2.5 acre thing. I mean, 5 acres is more than 210,000 square feet. I mean, it's larger than, it's like having a big box store there. But also, I don't think that our committees and review boards would be overwhelmed by the huge amount of differences between a 2.5 acre and a 5 acre, solar system. I think that it would be better to just go with, I guess, the medium as being the large, and then maybe we just have those two scales.
Okay, Will.
I thought 5 acres was too large, just because of how much stuff there is involved, and for the same reason, I think it is a safety issue over time. It's not just that the panels degrade, but a system that large is going to supply more than just what's on site, and you want someone to maintain that, because there are substances that can eventually leach out if the panels aren't maintained. They can be damaged in storms, blowing branches. Who knows when a deer could end up jumping on one of those things. And you do need someone to come through and fix them. Otherwise, you have things like not chemicals, but minerals like cadmium leaching out. So if that's not important, then I guess it's okay to leave everything there. But I'm thinking you'd want the equipment removed at some point. You wouldn't want it just left there to weather. And you can put my hand down.
Okay. I guess I had done a medium versus large, and I'm happy with 2.5 acres. Thinking, so on the one hand, Catherine, there is a difference when something's going to cover 50 or 100 or 200 acres. At that point, I think there's some
really big.
Right. So at that point, there are aesthetics issues, visual issues, wildlife issues that become more relevant. Whereas at some smaller size, those really aren't that important of questions that I think, personal philosophy, the town should be sticking their nose into that business. So again, in the back of my head, I was like, okay, so Ed Cope built that array on the hillside there off Old 76. And, what was it sort of reasonable to expect him to have done in terms of checking things out? And so yeah, I think that there are noise limits, right? You don't want to impinge on your neighbor's peace and quiet. I think light. So all those things are important for either size, but there are some different impacts with the really large ones that I felt, yeah, medium and large could have different sets. So that was my thinking. And again, that can be, I think next time is obviously we're going to get down to the nuts and bolts of the law and we can trash one section or the other in favor of one set. But I think I will continue to try to see if it makes sense to have a smaller medium that has somewhat lighter requirements so that indeed, because it's only covering a couple acres, maybe it's okay that it doesn't have to involve wildlife studies, for example. But I agree there are aesthetics issues that could be important for 2 acres as much as 200. Good points, all.
Well, and it comes back to Barb, wise Barb, of what would be relaxed, right?
Yes.
In each size thing.
Yes, and that's where I made some things in the law, and we need to go through them line by line and say, yeah, we like that, and no, we don't like that, because I just made a stab at it, and that was intentional, but it would then be modified from there. All right, so I think what we're going to do now, I will finish making sure that the Google Doc version of the law is up to date, make some of the changes in terms of the smaller size, sharpening up the lists, and I have a couple of other things to do, but then anyone else can jump in and add stuff that they were working on or want to do. It'll be a public document, public within our planning board. And then we'll meet in 2 weeks and sort of go through it, I think, section by section. That seemed like a plan. All right. Anybody have anything else they want to say or address before we close the meeting?
Yeah, Bill, I have a question of something I want to see if the board thinks it's appropriate or not. I learn a lot from examples, so it was very educational to me to talk to the grazers that are actually in the farm, the person. So one of the things that I wanted to do, but I wasn't sure if it was a sensitive issue, is I'd like to call up Tony Travelli and ask him to give me a walk through his property and tell me what is it that they exactly want to do and where are they trying to put it. It's not so much, what I don't want to do is create an impression that we're developing this law to facilitate any particular owner or project, but just going through examples like that helps me think about what are the issues that should go. So my question is it appropriate for me to do that, or is it something I shouldn't do if I'm interacting with the planning board like this?
Mark, you have anything to say?
Yeah, I would not recommend that. I would strongly not recommend that. It's at this time, it's not appropriate. That's all I would say, because the developer has indicated an intent to submit a waiver. And so it's, I think it's appropriate to maintain separation at this point. So
I can accept.
And on the other hand, you can certainly go take a look at the other community solar farms that have gone in. There's certainly that one off of Ferguson Road or whatever, and various other places, and that might be instructive as well. Yeah. But yes, I agree. At some point, it's like, yeah, let's look at Caroline and say, what if it went there? How, what would we want to ask someone to do or not do if they were planning to put it there? And that's, so driving around town is not a bad idea also.
I think that's really a good idea, actually. I've done it, and you can really see the difference in a few of the sites.
Okay. All right, well, great. Thank you all. And we will keep working on this.
So, somebody is trying to ask a question.
Sorry. Yeah. I thought that was a waving goodbye, but of course, yes, Bruce, go ahead.
Just a quick note. When you were talking safety and you were talking size and acreage and stuff, one thing you might want to consider is like where you locate according to size, because you can change and alter wildlife corridors as far as travel. So if it's near a road or real close to somebody's property and there's a gully there or something, just safety wise, you might be directing animals to the road, or to another piece of property. So it's just, it could affect the safety factor.
Excellent point, Bruce. Again, we have limited ways to affect that. There are setback distances I put in the law for the large systems that are just basically what the state said and hope that we could make that stick.
Right.
But
Well, I'm just
yes,
saying, a 5 acre versus 2.5 is pretty substantial. So,
Okay. Good point. Okay. Good night, everyone.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, everybody.
Good night.
very
Bye,
good.
guys.
Stay well.